I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the first direct talks between Ukraine and Russia in over 3 years begin in Istanbul, we report live from two other major conferences taking place in Europe. Just how strong is European resolve? Then we sit down with a former senior US official to discuss whether Trump's power is already waning.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 16th of May, 3 years and 82 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, dialing in from Estonia, I'm joined by Associate Editor of Defence Dominic Nicholls, and from the European Political Summit in Albania, our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. Later, you'll hear our latest interview with friend of the podcast Professor Eliot Cohen, contributing writer at The Atlantic and former counsellor to the head of the US State Department. But first, the latest military and political developments of the last 24 hours. Despite the start of peace talks in Istanbul, the conflict zones across Ukraine and Russia remain active. Over the past 24 hours, both sides have carried out extensive aerial operations, resulting in significant damage and civilian casualties. Yesterday ended with a sizable fire and several explosions reported in Russia's Moscow region. This morning, a Russian ammunition depot near Perevalna, a military town close to the Crimean coast, appears to have been hit during a large aerial assault. Witnesses observed thick smoke and secondary explosions in the area. Moscow has claimed it intercepted 65 Ukrainian drones overnight and into this morning, stating that all but one were taken down over Crimea or the surrounding Black Sea. In turn, Russia launched its own drone offensive overnight, deploying over 100 Shahed drones targeting various regions. Ukrainian air defence systems successfully intercepted the majority of them. According to Ukrainian sources, only 3 managed to get through their defences. Now, those attacks have left at least 4 civilians dead and around 30 injured. In Kyiv, falling drone debris sparked fires in one district. Whilst there were no fatalities reported in the capital, authorities are still working to assess the full extent of the damage there. In Odessa, 3 people were injured. All are currently recovering in hospital. Meanwhile, there's been extensive destruction reported in areas of Free Donetsk. At least 1 civilian has been confirmed killed and 3 others wounded. Reports are still emerging, especially from Konstantinivka, which reportedly continues to be struck by aerial and glide bombs as we speak. Now, the Ukrainian Air Force said it lost another F-16 fighter jet overnight, which are used in defensive measures, of course, to shoot down missiles and other projectiles. They say the pilot successfully ejected around 3:30 a.m, performing a task to repel an enemy air attack, destroying 3 air targets, and was working on the 4th when an emergency occurred. Now, I've scoured the frontline ground movements this morning to see if there's been anything significant. There's nothing major to report today. So instead, I'm going to focus on another significant military story: Putin's dismissal of General Oleg Salyukov as Commander-in-Chief of Russia's ground forces. That's a role he's held since 2014, when he was involved in the Syrian civil war. Now, Salyukov was nearing mandatory retirement and has been reassigned as Deputy Secretary of the Russian Security Council. It was he who oversaw and has overseen Moscow's Victory Day parades over the past decade, and since 2023 served as Deputy to the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, overseeing operations in Ukraine. Now, we don't know many more details yet. Of course, this reshuffle comes amid ongoing challenges in Ukraine and efforts to modernise and restructure Russia's armed forces. His successor is Colonel General Andrei Mordvichev, who oversaw the capture of Mariupol in 2022 and Avdiivka in 2024. He's colloquially known as General Blood. We'll be sure to do a deeper dive into him as we learn more. But let's return to Turkey now, where the first direct peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in 3 years have kicked off today, albeit without Putin or Zelensky present. The meeting between the two delegations began around 10 a.m. local time. That's 7 a.m. London time. The talks, we understand, will take place in different formats. Turkish officials indicate that trilateral talks between Russia, Ukraine and Turkey are on the agenda, and possibly a round of US, Ukrainian and Turkish talks. It has not been finalised whether there will be a quadrilateral format, the force added, i.e. involving all of those parties. Now, while these talks mark the first direct negotiations between the Russian and Ukrainian officials in 3 years, hopes for a breakthrough, as we discussed extensively yesterday, remain extremely low. On Thursday, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Washington had no high expectations for the discussions. Ukraine's already this morning accused Russia of undermining these talks by demanding, at the last minute, a one-on-one meeting that excluded any other officials. As we discussed in detail yesterday, Moscow's delegation symbolically mirrors that of 2022, the same individuals who took part in the earlier Istanbul talks, suggesting Russia is still pursuing its original maximalist goals. As a reminder, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times reported in March and June 2024 that they had obtained multiple versions of the draft Istanbul proposals. They demanded that Ukraine abandon its NATO ambitions and enshrine neutrality in its constitution, barring membership in any military alliances. They also prohibited Ukraine from hosting foreign troops, trainers or weapons systems. Russia insisted that it, along with the US, UK, China, France and Belarus, serve as guarantors of that agreement, and that these states terminate any treaties conflicting with Ukraine's permanent neutrality, including those enabling military aid. Further demands included strict caps on Ukraine's armed forces to 85,000 soldiers, 342 tanks and 519 artillery systems, and a missile range limit of just 40 kilometres, effectively allowing Russia to position key systems near Ukraine without risk. Now, these terms, as I say, were put forward in the early months of Russia's full-scale invasion, when its forces were advancing on Kyiv and gaining ground across Ukraine. Now, 3 years later, Moscow is attempting to revive those same demands, despite having been pushed out of northern Ukraine and suffering major setbacks in Kharkiv and Kherson, and struggling in other sectors too. Yet, Kremlin envoy Vladimir Medinsky, who's deliberately framing these talks as a continuation of 2022, is casting the original demands as being absolutely legitimate. Andriy Yermak, the head of President Zelensky's office, in response is dismissing that attempt. He said today the only thing that connects today's negotiations to 2022 is the city of Istanbul. Nothing more. All attempts by Russia to link the current moment to 2022 will fail. So given all that, it's clear why expectations for meaningful progress are so low. The delegation Russia sent in is widely seen as junior and lacking decision-making power, a point Zelensky emphasised after our broadcast yesterday, saying Putin had disrespected, his words, both Trump and Erdogan by sending such a low-level team. Another Ukrainian official said the delegation has no fundamental authority, and that if they do, they have to prove it by agreeing to concrete steps, especially a ceasefire. Ukraine's allies are echoing that line. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte said yesterday Putin had made a big mistake by sending a lower-ranking team, adding, "All the pressure is now on Putin. He has to be serious about wanting peace." Other European leaders have voiced similar sentiments, including the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the EU's Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas. Secretary Rubio, who has also arrived in Istanbul ahead of these talks, again reiterated his low expectations, noting that Putin's absence signalled a lack of seriousness. So it is worth noting that much of this diplomatic theatre is aimed at Donald Trump, an attempt to show who is obstructing peace, i.e. the Russians. Yet Trump said yesterday he would like to meet Putin as soon as we can set it up. And as others have pointed out, when Trump claims that only he can broker a deal, He is, in essence, reinforcing Putin's narrative that Ukraine is merely a proxy, whose fate should be settled in US-Russia talks over the heads of European allies and Ukraine itself. We shouldn't forget that. Ultimately, therefore, the hard truth remains. Russia will not stop unless it is compelled to. And if Trump is ultimately unwilling to apply that pressure, it will fall to Europe. We just have to hope they're ready. But let's stay with Europe and bring in Dom now, joining us live from Estonia, presumably upright and caffeinated. Dom, for years, you've been on a one-man crusade to try and convert me to the cult of the early morning run. But did today's crack of dawn start shake your resolve?
No. Hello, Francis. No is the short answer. I was reminded that quote from Spike Milligan, who said 3 o'clock in the morning was a time invented by Hitler to win the war. It was particularly ugly when that alarm went off, but got here intact. And apart from a particularly officious Lufthansa woman, Heathrow, untroubled. So got here for the Leonard Merry conference. It's starting in a couple of hours. And it's going to be a weekend with some pretty decent speakers. You've got the President and the Prime Minister of Estonia speaking. You've got numerous foreign ministers, defence ministers and chiefs of defence from Europe speaking. But it's not just a kind of Euro loving. There's officials from Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt here as well, and the US. So it's happening at the right time. I've asked for numerous interviews. I've got a few lined up. They keep asking me, what kind of questions do you think you'll ask? It's like, I don't know, something about Ukraine, Trump, the future of the world, who knows? Anyway, so the theme of this year's conference is We Shall Go Forward Together, which sounded a little bit speechy, and digging into the blurb, it turns out it was a speech. So in 1942, when the Allies were kind of on the back foot, Churchill gave a speech telling an audience in Leeds, we shall go forward together. So that's where the theme comes from. But like I say, it starts in a couple of hours. We've got the Foreign Minister of Poland, Mr. Sikorski, he's speaking. We've also got the Foreign Minister of Estonia here in a couple of hours. And then we've got defence ministers and all sorts for the rest of the day. Rather troublingly, they've got these things called night owl sessions that don't start until 10 o'clock. Go on until 11:15 at night. I'm normally in my pajamas by then with a nightcap, but I will make the effort just for you, Francis, and go to these night owl sessions to see what's happening there. But yeah, that's it for the weekend. So I was hoping to get to know Tallinn. I've only ever been here once before, and that was just as we were coming out of lockdown, and the place was pretty empty. Everything was shut up. It was all a bit tired and closed. But I was looking forward to it, but I don't know how much time I'm going to get. There's lots to be seen here. The old town is absolutely beautiful. I can see it here from the 22nd floor of my hotel, but I don't know how much time I'm going to have to actually go out and about. But if anyone's got any top tips for what to do in Tallinn near the old town, if I've got a quick hour to spare, then I'd appreciate it. But I'll let you know everything on Monday, Francis. I'm back with you in the hub.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Good luck. And if you interview Kaja Kallas again instead of me, I'm going to be fundamentally cheesed off. But anyway, one to await for Monday. Let's bring in... She's there, is she? Oh, God. Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, I'll put in a good word for you if I manage to speak to her again. Of course, it wouldn't be the first time I've spoken to Kaja Kallas, but I'll try and put in a good word for you, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. And we'll have to just wait and see, won't we? Please don't let Dom send me a text saying that he's just had drinks with Kaja Kallas. Anyway, let's bring in Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. Now, Joe, when we last left you were about to dash off to buy a doner kebab in Istanbul before an amble around Old Byzantium. But now you're in a totally different country. So where are you exactly? Why are you there? And how was that kebab?
Hi, folks. The kebab, firstly, fantastic. It was a Dearnley wrap with some sort of kofta inside with all the chili sauce and salad. Fantastically served with some Turkish tea, some sort of rice pudding with sort of semolina with like a cream inside. Fantastic. The full works while I wrote my dispatch from Istanbul on what appeared and became the failed talks between Zelensky and Putin. But after that, I jumped in a cab, which is only described as a similar scene to Wacky Races as you dart through the highways of Istanbul out to the airport, where I caught a direct flight from Istanbul on Air Albania to Tirana, where the European political community is meeting for its sixth time since its formation in the early days of the full-scale invasion. It was to give you some reminder on what this is, it's a meeting of some 40 to 50 heads of state from Europe and its near neighbours. It was the brainchild of Emmanuel Macron. It held its first iteration in Prague. has since been held in Moldova, the UK, Spain, Hungary, and now we're also here in Albania, where Edi Rama, the newly re-elected Prime Minister, is hosting leaders. As you can imagine, much to your annoyance, Francis, I had a brief chat with Kaja Kallas this morning. I asked her about Brexit rather than Ukraine, but you've reiterated her words on Ukraine nicely.
I can't believe this. I'm sorry. This is all a bit much for me. But anyway, carry on, Joe.
So yeah, as you can imagine, the main topic in the room today is what happened yesterday in Istanbul, or what didn't happen yesterday in Istanbul, and what is currently happening in Istanbul. So currently, to give you some sort of colour, I am stood outside the National Opera and Ballet House of Albania, where all the leaders are huddled round a big square table, currently giving addresses. Keir Starmer has spoken to them, and he has basically said that Vladimir Putin has played them, has played Donald Trump, and played mainly Ukraine like a fiddle. He's playing games, he's dragging his heels, he's deliberately prolonging these peace talks, making it look like he's involved when in reality all he wants to do is continue the war. And Keir Starmer was saying, look, now is the time. We've promised, we've issued this ultimatum saying if you don't agree with Vladimir Putin to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, we will hit you with sanctions. And his visit to Tirana today can basically be described as trying to galvanize support for those sanctions, which is interesting. But you've also had President Zelensky is here. He's in the room. He had a little huddle with President Macron of France, and Keir Starmer before those talks happened. They're going to be having their sort of mini huddles on the sideline, coalition of the willing lights, as we could call them. Keir Starmer's hosting a roundtable on defence and security, which is going to be mainly aimed at, as I mentioned earlier, those sanctions. But yeah, it's all go here. It's very early days, but the main messages are, we think Putin's wrong, and we think those sanctions that we promised need to be rolled out. And they thought we're waiting for news from Istanbul, really. We've basically seen what everyone else has seen on Twitter and social media, Telegram, etc., but waiting for sort of concrete word back to Zelensky, who I'm sure once he hears will give his readout on his version of events as is happening in Istanbul, and that will only shape the messages as the day goes on.
Well, thanks very much, Joe, for that overview. I mean, are you optimistic that we'll see any progress at this summit, or is it really just going to be a reiteration of the lines that we've seen so far this week? It doesn't feel like there's masses of excitement about this, but as you say, it is not an insignificant event when you've got 50 European leaders in one room. It has been an extraordinary week. If you look back to the weekend when we saw, of course, Macron and Tusk and Starmer and Merz in Kyiv, these are amazing times, and yet it seems we've just become totally adjusted to that fact. But just interested in your sense on whether we can expect there to be perhaps some sort of sizable announcement, Joe.
Yeah, I think I also underappreciate how significant this week had been for just the broad umbrella of what is international diplomacy. I make my living by jetting around the world, around Europe, covering these summits for Telegraph readers and our listeners at home. But ultimately, while there is going to be no decision taken here, the European Political Community, or EPC for short, isn't about making decisions. It's essentially a talking shop on what are the major issues facing Europe and its near neighbourhood. So security, migration are the main two topics. Ukraine has been at the centre of all of these gatherings. But today is not a time for decisions. But what can be done is used as a vehicle to drive the narrative, drive people in the right direction for those decisions when they are made. So yeah, not quite yet, but it will be soon where we see those decisions made in capitals, in Brussels for the EU, in London for the UK, and hopefully Washington for the US.
Yesterday, Dom and I sat down with long-standing writer and frequent contributor to the podcast, Professor Eliot Cohen. Writer at The Atlantic, former counsellor to the head of the US State Department, and a member of the intelligence community. He was visiting London before he too travels to Estonia for the same conference Dom is attending this weekend. In the conversation you're about to hear, we discuss whether President Trump's power is at its height or already falling, what lessons he takes from the way warfare is evolving in both the Middle East and Ukraine, whether US foreign policy in Europe was ever reliable, and whether there has been a systematic decline in the quality of officialdom in recent decades. This is our conversation.
Eliot, thanks so much for joining us here today at The Telegraph. Now, you've written recently an article for The Atlantic, I think it was back in March, somewhat provocatively titled, "Europe Can't Trust the US Anymore." But in that article, you describe three streams of influence on Trump and the Trump administration. Number one, Trump's personality itself, and you use some fairly choice language to describe that. Secondly, you talk about the marginal intellectuals and podcast ranters. It's got my attention.
Yeah, takes one to know one.
Right. But you then also talk about structural elements, i.e., the decades-long story of loss of manufacturing jobs, identity politics, etc., etc. So within that cocktail of those three, where do you see US foreign policy as being forged at the moment?
So first, great to be back on the pod with you. I mean, the answer is it's a mix. It's a mix of Trump's very distinctive personality, which includes impatience, certain kind of grandiosity, his view, interestingly, of himself as a peacemaker, which isn't may not be the first word that leaps to mind, but I think that's actually a very important part of his self-conception. The fact that he's a second-term president, so he's looking for legacy, a whole bunch of psychological things like that. I think the structural forces, though, are very important. And one of the things I often do when I'm speaking with European audiences, I will read excerpts from a speech by the Secretary of Defense, ranting and raving about Europe taking the American taxpayer for granted, not spending enough money on defense, and so on and so forth. And then I always say, by the way, that's not Pete Hegseth, that's Bob Gates. And saying that during the Obama administration, though he said the same thing in the Bush administration as well. And so I think part of what's happened is, Trump is a cause, just as his own personality, but he's also a catalyst and a symptom. And part of what he's catalyzing are some pretty deeply felt sentiments, even among Atlanticist Americans like myself. And so I think that's why, to kind of tie a bow around this, I think even after Trump passes from the scene in almost 4 years, things will be different. I mean, it doesn't mean the United States will simply abandon Europe. I don't think that's going to happen. But it will be a different kind of relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I will leap ahead to a point I was going to make later, but actually it sort of segues with what you were just saying there. You also say towards the end of this piece, you say, after the past 2 months, i.e. since the inauguration of Donald Trump 2, after the past 2 months, there cannot and should not ever be trust between the US and Europe. You talk about a divergence that can never be repaired. Now, I remember when I did staff college, like a good young officer, I was always told never is a 100% word. You've got to be very careful about using that word. So do you care to revise either of those statements, or do you stick by them?
Being a writer and a former professor, I would never admit to revising any of my views about anything. But here's what I would say is, the first thing is, let us not assume that there was always this implicit trust in the United States. I think one of the peculiarities of the moment we're in is that some of the same people who I remember lacerating me when I was a member of the Bush administration, actually both Bush administrations, both father and son, are now waxing poetic about the wonderful halcyon days of 80 years where we completely trusted the Americans, and somehow, Iraq, Vietnam, the intermediate nuclear force disputes, those didn't exist. Well, of course, they've always been there. And I think the fundamental differences have always been there. They will be worse. I think, just thinking from a European point of view, that it's really a description of what I think are probably the objective circumstances where, I believe most thoughtful people on this side of the Atlantic, one Trump they could understand, the first Trump administration, because none of us, including me, knew what to expect. Having reelected somebody who is this manifestly unfit and dangerous and erratic, I can understand why it will make some people question the stability of our policy. And unfortunately, I think they'll be right to do so. Now, I will admit to one ulterior motive in that piece, which is to try to goad people on this side of the pond to spend enough money on their own defense and treat it with the seriousness it deserves, but it hasn't received, except from countries like Finland or Poland.
Yeah. Again, are you looking at my notes here? Because that was my next question. This point about Europe's unhealthy dependence upon the US. I was minded of Newton's first law, the law of equilibrium, which says an object, and I'm thinking about Europe, living off the large S in terms of the security dimension of the US here, an object stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. Okay, so is Donald Trump the unbalanced force that Europe needed? And allied to that, is it just political reality that you as an individual or as a country, as a leader, you're not going to go out of your way to invite pain if someone else is paying your bills? So is Europe's dependence upon the US as much the fault of the US? And actually Donald Trump, when you say he's manifestly unfit, is he just actually bringing to a head something that needed to have done decades ago by presidents who shirked it?
I think there's something to that. The problem is you could never deliver an adequate shock to Europe on your own without having really a credible threat of abandonment. And because Trump is who he is, it is credible that he would abandon Europe. It wouldn't be credible for, say, the presidents that I've worked for to threaten that, because at the end of the day, you don't think that they would really do it. Now, of course, the other part of it is, look, a lot of the European states, very much including Britain, very much including Germany for that matter, had serious and credible militaries during the Cold War when they were seized of the threat that was on their doorstep. So you can say that part of the fault is us for having nursed Europe along, but I wouldn't want to let Europeans off the hook for failing to see the basic fact, which is that, for 1 decade, 2 decades, you've been looking at this very large, very aggressive, predatory power to the east, and with the exception of a few countries that I've already mentioned, nobody's really willing to give it the serious attention that it needs, which means not patting yourself on the back for breaking 2%, but being serious about 5%, which is, I think, actually the kind of effort that it's going to require to really contain a Russia which has the advantage of being at least one country up against several dozen.
Mm. Now, as you say, you've worked across a number of different administrations. You've worked directly for a number of US presidents. You say Donald Trump cannot separate the personal from the public. And I wonder if that's part of the root issue that he has with President Zelensky after the whole Hunter Biden affair. And if you look at how just this week Saudi Arabia has played him very well, as in the personal $200 billion worth of orders for Boeing. You've seen Qatar with the Cybertruck convoy. So they've kind of worked out how to play him. But actually, when did you last see a US president that has achieved that separation between personal and public? It's all personal, isn't it? They all have their agenda, their beliefs, their fundamental, the roots that make them the people that they are. And so is it unfair to say you expect a president to separate the personal from the public?
So I'm tempted to say it is impossible to be unfair to Donald Trump. Look, here, first, there's an element of personal corruption. I mean, the thing you didn't mention is Qatar offering him a $400 million airplane.
Well, if I may. Now, we've got a book here at the Telegraph. If we offer gifts more than £200, we have to declare that if we want to take it. I mean, if this is a gift to the President of the United States, and it exists for the next 40 years, or however long a Boeing survives, after Donald Trump too, what's wrong with that?
So the first thing is that the original story was it was going to be his to keep after his presidency and then go into a presidential library, which doesn't make any sense at all. No, but this was clearly designed to pander to him in a very direct monetary way. In the same way, a lot of the crypto stuff and so on. I mean, of course, foreign countries are always going to play to a president's ego, and you don't get to be president unless you have a pretty monumental ego. But I think the larger question is, can a president separate their personal resentments and sense of ill treatment or personal animosities from the job at hand? And I think presidents struggle with that to different extents. FDR couldn't get over his animosity to de Gaulle, if you want to go back a bit. But with Trump, it's something very different. I mean, what's interesting now, I've always rejected the idea that Trump is simply an agent of the FSB being run by, or the SVR being run by Vladimir Putin. But I think he is struggling with that personal relationship, which has helped lead to a kind of animosity to Zelensky, and break with it. He may very well get there. But I think he, more than most, finds it very, very difficult to separate his personality with all of its quirks and, as I said, resentments and so on, from his job, which is to be president of the United States. And most presidents take the dignity of the office quite seriously and their national responsibilities quite seriously, whatever their foibles may be.
Okay. Just before I hand over to Francis, you talk about the dignity of the office there. More broadly, not just the president, but others in the administration. How self-indulgent do you think, now looking back, that image of Antony Blinken playing guitar in that bar in Kyiv. I mean, when we now know quite what was happening in terms of support over military, political, monetary support for Ukraine, I mean, do you, having been a member of previous administrations, can you look at that and not cringe?
Of course I cringe. I mean, if you follow American politics and, you're a patriot and have some idea of what high office is supposed to be like, you're going to be cringing all the time. Absolutely. And again, if anybody follows what I've written in The Atlantic knows, I was quite harsh on the Biden administration and harsh on the Obama administration as well, which deserves actually more criticism than it has gotten. But no, this is something that has changed, unfortunately, and it's a reflection of popular culture. Ronald Reagan would never go into the Oval Office except in a suit and tie. If he was coming into work on a Saturday or Sunday, he would get into a suit and tie to go into the Oval Office and sit behind the Resolute desk. That's not the way Bill Clinton played it or Barack Obama. I mean, different presidents have had different attitudes. And the more you, I think, lose those external manifestations of respect for the gravity and dignity of the office, the more likely you are to do things which are not just unseemly, but in a more fundamental way to be unserious about your responsibilities, which is in some ways, I think, where the Biden administration ended up.
Eliot, always a pleasure to talk to you and great to have you here in The Telegraph today. Staying on this theme around leadership and previous presidents, you're also a historian and you look at these issues through that lens. Could one not say that it is historically inevitable, and I know that's a very strong word to use, historically inevitable, that given all of the factors in play, whether it be Trump's personality, the people he has around him, that he is going to fail and his power is going to decline over the course of his presidency? Would you agree with that analysis? And what do you think the ramifications of that are going to be? If we can get past this, some would argue, this next few months, perhaps this next year and a half, it's only going to be a weakened presidency, and therefore there's room for optimism.
So, like you, I'm very hesitant about using the word inevitable. And since Dom has already caught me out once, I'm not gonna let you guys catch me out again by playing some quote from this interview.
But I know you're not a Marxist, Eliot, which is the biggest on in terms of inevitability.
No, that's right.
History.
It's very true. I am not a Marxist, as much as it may surprise people. Look, I think the probabilities are that he gets weakened by a number of things. The most important thing is he's, the two of you, me, people who listen to this podcast are obsessed with Ukraine, quite properly so. I think the way to understand Trump is to understand he is not obsessed with Ukraine. For him, this is part and parcel of a whole bunch of other things that are going on. And one of the things that is going on is that the administration is very quickly building lots of brick walls to drive into. And you saw that with an incredibly reckless tariff policy, but you're seeing that with some extremely destructive things they're doing to American science, even things, I wouldn't call them minor because they're actually important, but things like slashing the National Park Service. So this summer, when people go to the Smokies or the Rockies or any of the other magnificent parks that we have, they're going to find piles of trash and things that are closed, and they'll be angry. For tariffs, they're certainly going to be upset. So I think what they're doing is they are, like many presidents, but always trumping Trump to excess, they are way overreading their mandate. They are doing a number of things which are kind of mutually contradictory, but certainly are going to hit the base that elected them. And so I think and you can already see this beginning to happen. They're running into internal opposition on things like cutting Medicaid and things of that nature. So that's one thing, and that's happening quite fast. The result of this, by the way, is he was more underwater in the polls than any president in history at the 100-day mark. He was 10% underwater, which is a pretty remarkable accomplishment in its own way. So I think that's one thing. They're creating these brick walls. Secondly, the historical pattern is that the incumbent gets trashed in the midterm elections. So I think even though the Democratic Party is in terrible shape, the Democratic candidates are not necessarily in terrible shape. So I think there's a good chance you're going to have a House of Representatives that's controlled by the Democrats, and who knows what the Senate will be like, and that will exercise some sort of break. Thirdly, he's old, and he's about to be 79. By the time you're 80 or 81, I'm sorry, I think people just slow down. I know there are exceptions, but I think he will kind of begin to get weary of some of this, particularly as various crises pop up. So what I guess I tend to expect is that there'll be sort of a declining intensity to this. But given the fundamental instability of the personality, the narcissism, the willfulness, the vindictiveness, I don't think you can breathe any sighs of relief until it's all over.
It's very interesting. Now, another heavily criticised president was George W. Bush. I mean, a man who I think people will recall, but it seems extraordinary now given what's happened since, was ridiculed, mocked internationally in a way that is certainly comparable to Trump, but to some degree would be worse, despite the fact that I think many people would look at Trump and say this is a totally different character and far worse, many would argue. Of course, you served under George W. Bush, and I wonder, when you reflect on that era, what lessons you take from it, and of course when you saw him up close and personal, what memories do you have of that time, and what virtues did he have as a leader compared to, say, a man like Trump?
So the first thing I think to say about George W. Bush is, again, of interest for people in this podcast, there is no doubt in my mind that he would have done the right thing by Ukraine, that he would have overseen us pouring a lot more aid in than Biden did, and he would have been steadfast, even if it was going to make him unpopular. And there are a number of points in his administration where he does that. Iraq hangs over the administration, and to some extent, understandably, and I think I share in some of that. I have been critical of some ways in which the war was run, but the unfairness to him was really tremendous. I was speaking recently at an event here in the United Kingdom, and I had next to me somebody who had been pretty senior in the Foreign Office, who, considerably to the left of me, I think, who was, saying rightly just how terrible it is that the U.S. has cut off its very large, very successful program to help prevent AIDS. So I finally, after a bit of this, I finally turned to her and said, do you know who launched that program? And the answer is, it's the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief was launched by George W. Bush, funded lavishly. That was a centerpiece for him. He believed in it. And it's had tremendous beneficial effects, certainly for the lives of all those affected, but also for the image of the United States, appropriately so. The other thing about Bush is, whatever else you think about him, he was a courageous decision maker. I saw that when they made the decision about the surge in Iraq. I saw it in sort of smaller ways, too, when you could see people getting shaken, including some very senior people. Cabinet secretaries, four-star generals.
May I just, this is the surge is the decision whether or not to basically pull out of Iraq or to go in with much greater force in order to try and see the job through. Five
more brigades, and extending the rotations of some of those who were there, in one of which my son was then serving. And that was a gutsy decision because the Joint Chiefs of Staff were actually against it. There's this famous episode in The Tank where the president meets with the Joint Chiefs, and somebody was saying, well, this will break the army. And his response was, no, what will break the army will be losing war. So there was a kind of courage. Now, other people would call it stubbornness and so on. I understand that. But no, I'm very proud to have worked for him. I have a lot of admiration for him, and I don't think we would be in the world situation we're in today if he were in office.
You mentioned the Middle East there. Of course, we've got a crisis in the Middle East as well at the moment, and certainly have over the duration of the war in Ukraine. When you reflect on Ukraine, the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, Iran, what cross-learning, if any, do you take as somebody who has expertise in both of those areas?
So it's interesting. I've been to Ukraine a number of times, and I've been to Israel a number of times. In one way, it's very different, large-scale land warfare. The case of Ukraine, degree of technology, some of the distances. That said, there are a number of things which are very striking to me, which where I think does need to be some cross-learning. One is the extent to which just about anybody can engage in ranged warfare. So the fact that the Ukrainians can reach out and touch Moscow and the Houthis can reach out and touch Tel Aviv, that's a very big deal. That's our world now, and we're going to be dealing with it. The extent to which, even in an era of very high technology, mass still matters. The Israelis put 5 small divisions into Gaza initially, and it was necessary given the size of the Hamas force that they were operating against, and they took a lot of casualties. And that's despite the fact that the Israelis were probably making more use of AI and drones and all that stuff, and they still took lots of casualties. And so I think the idea that You're going to have wars where, because of your technological advantage, you're not going to be taking casualties. Not so. So I think there's a lot of cross-learning there. Then, in both cases, when you step back and look at the conflicts, the poverty of the strategy making on both sides, sort of why do we think that these different operations that we're doing are going to yield the result that we want on both sides, in both sets of conflicts, is really striking. And it does. I have a chair in strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, so I'm going to say strategy is important, but I really think so. It is so much easier to begin focusing on tactics and first-person view drones, and the fiber optic cables make the biggest difference, and can you jam HIMARS, and that's all really important. And you do a wonderful job of explaining that, and I'm glad you do. But there are these larger strategic questions, and those end up being, I think, so difficult that people just kind of put them aside. And that, by the way, was part of my government experience as well, seeing that firsthand.
You mentioned those strategic failings. A mutual friend of ours, Philip O'Brien, is just writing a new book at the moment where he provocatively argues that because of that failure to have a coherent strategy that has been pursued to the end state, that the United States has not won a war since the Second World War. Do you agree with that analysis?
No, I think that's ridiculous. It's absurd. When we went to war in Korea, did we completely turn the communists out of North Korea? No. Did we preserve an independent South Korea that's a free country? Yeah, we did. And it's an amazingly prosperous and free, if rambunctious democracy. I would count that as a win. The first Gulf War, I think that was a win. And the second Gulf War was a win in a different sense, in terms of what eventually happened to Saddam Hussein, and Afghanistan too, in a different way. I think where I would disagree with our friend Phil is ultimately strategy is about politics. And actually there's this French novelist, Maurice Drouin, who wrote The Iron Kings, which is it's a great series for people who like medieval blood and guts. But he was also been a member of the government. He'd been in the resistance. And he has a beautiful passage, which I quote in this book that I'm writing right now, where he says, look, it's the nature of politics that solving one problem leads to another problem. And I would say that about World War II. I mean, did we not win World War II because Poland and Czechoslovakia ended up behind the Iron Curtain? No, I wouldn't put it that way. Winning and losing is not really a binary thing at the end of the day. The question is, which of your objectives do you achieve, at what cost, and what new problems have you created? Because there are always going to be new problems.
So drawing this, sort of coming towards the end, but drawing back to where we started with the Trump administration, just looking through time, I've been trying to work out, when we look at how, you talk about the streams of influence through which this administration exerts its will, I'm trying to work out if this movement, it's too easy to call it MAGA, but yeah, the Trump movement, if he is a symptom or a cause of it, or both. Yeah. And if you have both, then you get into ism territory, i.e. Trumpism. It's an idea that will exist beyond him. When was the last time there was an ism? I'm trying to think back, I'm stuttering at Reaganism, but actually it's been a while since we've had different administrations with different policy agendas and priorities. Absolutely fine. That's that messy stuff called democracy. But the last ism, and do you think Donald Trump is a symptom and a cause, and we are now in Trumpism?
Yeah, well, of course, the easy answer is he's both. Look, it is clearly populism. There's that. But, maybe I can reframe the question a little bit, if you don't mind, Dom.
You didn't like it when I said never was 100% work,
No, I didn't like
You're
that.
Coming back at me.
I didn't like that.
Go on, then reframe my question.
And I'm the
tell me what question I should have asked.
And I'm the kind of guy who's always waiting for payback. So
fair enough.
No, I think when we think about Trump, one thing that periodically irritates me is when perfectly well-meaning scholars of fascism, which is an ism, right, or the 30s, this is just like the 30s, or people who look at the post-communist regime say, oh, this is Viktor Orban. I think that's a big mistake. I mean, there are some common elements, I get that. This is a very American kind of movement. I had a piece in The Atlantic called We Need a Mirror, Not a Window. It is coming out of some very specific American circumstances. It is very much shaped by the personality of this guy. Now, he is a catalyst, I think, for things that were always there, a certain neo-isolationism, There's a sort of ethno-nationalism, although you got to be careful with that because actually he got more individuals of color in this round than he did the previous time. There's an element of the religious right. There's the sort of tech bro, technological enthusiast. What he has uniquely been able to do is to kind of bring those people together. He's a symptom, I would say, of several things. One, which is universal across all our societies, and that's the rise of social media and your possibility of living in a bubble, including a very paranoid bubble, as opposed to having to go through gatekeepers like the Telegraph or the New York Times or what have you. He's also a symptom of the weakening of congressional power and authority in the United States. One thing that people need to realize is almost everything he has done is by executive order. They have passed no laws, effectively. And the precedents for just about everything he has done have been set over the past decades and even more. So, for example, the tariffs. Congress those are the ones who are supposed to vote on tariffs. So why aren't they? Well, and I think it was 1971, they gave Richard Nixon the right to invoke emergency powers to impose tariffs. The idea that you can suspend spending, well, Barack Obama thought he could do that. Joe Biden thought he could cancel, I think it was $400 billion worth of college loans. So you've had this steady expansion of executive power. I think it's dawning on the Democrats. That was a bad thing to do. And I think...
And Biden pardoned his son.
Right. And of course, then Trump being Trump, he takes it a whole level beyond that and in a much worse way. So, here's the possibly optimistic read that I would give, or the more optimistic read. Ultimately, although I am always a short-term and medium-term pessimist, I'm a long-term optimist about the United States. And I think there will be a period of reckoning post-Trump where people will wrestle with this. Now, the problem is that in the interim, things can be bad. And even while that's happening, we may be so inwardly focused that we don't do enough abroad.
Two more for me to finish off with. You said Donald Trump's a catalyst for things that were always there. And earlier, you said the Obama administration deserves more criticism than it got. Well, those trends that were already there clearly must have existed whilst Obama was in power. So what should he have seen? Or what did he see and didn't act upon? But what are some of these currents that are now bubbling up?
So, actually, for Obama, actually, I had a sort of much narrower thing. He completely did not see Russia. I worked in the ill-fated Mitt Romney campaign. And, I remember him taunting Romney saying, no, this guy's very dangerous and is a serious threat to us. He got that wrong. He has never retracted that, by the way.
Obama.
Yeah. And to give the devil his due, the Trump administration sent javelins, at least, to Ukraine. Obama was not willing to send them any arms. And it'd be a big mistake for Europeans to think that Obama cared about them. He did not. In general, I don't think he was a particularly internationally minded president other than, climate change and stuff like that. But he had no particular affection for Europe or kind of emotional commitment the way most of our other presidents have.
Yeah. Finally, from me, so the next election is 2028 presidential election. I don't know if you're a betting man, Eliot, but let's posit late 26, maybe early 27, but late 26. Donald Trump replaces J.D. Vance as vice president with his daughter, Ivanka. So Ivanka Trump is vice president. And then Donald Trump steps down for ill health, giving her a year to run at the presidency under her own ticket, brackets with him in the background. What odds would you put on that scenario?
I will say that you have a fertile imagination, but I don't think anything remotely like that will happen. First, among other things, I don't think Ivanka wants it. The other thing is the president can't just fire a vice president and then hire a new vice president. The vice president is an elected official of the United States. And people have actually concocted all kinds of schemes. So, actually what will happen is J.D. Vance will run for president and Trump will be vice president, and then J.D. Vance will resign and Trump will become president. These people are all sharks. They all want power. Even, at the moment, J.D. Vance and Don Jr. are friends. They'll be friends until it's clear that only one of them can become president, and the other will have to play second fiddle in some way. So, no, I think you're stuck with this. And I can't imagine Trump giving up power. I think power is a narcotic, and he's grown dependent on it. And as most politicians do, I would say that's why they hang around until they're really totally in their dotage. And so I think he'll hang on to the bitter end. And, look, if you look at, the Biden case is so interesting because he was so clearly past it, totally past it. It was visible 2 years before, and he could not let go.
So no Ivanka Trump for vice president. However, and at the risk of having that spat again, all I'll say is never say never.
I'll take that.
To end on another example of somebody drunk on power, we were jokingly yesterday sort of talking about the fact that Trump is a bit like a Roman emperor, to which you replied, and not Marcus Aurelius, which I thought was a good way of putting it. But there was a serious point behind why I put that to you, which is that I was saying that in the first, century or so of the emperors, you could have good ones and you could have bad ones. But because of the capabilities of the generals, of the administrators, of the system, of the bureaucracy, however one wants to describe it, it didn't matter whether you had bad ones because things just sustained themselves. Do you think there has been a decline in the caliber of the administrators, the machine operators behind the throne in America in the last, let's say, 20 or 30 years? Or do you think that really it is still going to be the superpower for a very, very long time yet? And some of these sort of most extremist predictions of a collapse of the Great Republic is overplayed?
Yeah, I certainly think that the predictions of the collapse of the Great Republic are really overplayed. I do think Trump is doing a lot of institutional damage. There's no question about that. I think one also has to be open to the possibility that there's some areas where they're actually going to do some good. And you had some institutions that needed to be shaken up. Now, they're doing that in an arbitrary, occasionally cruel, frequently stupid way. So I think it's more damage much more damage than just saying, well, the rest of the country functions. On the other hand, and this is where I think, things like comparisons to Viktor Orban are just ridiculous. This is a huge country, 350 million people, 50 states. They all have legislatures, they all have governors, they have mayors, you have courts. Our friend David Kilcullen, when he was an Australian, I think lieutenant colonel, serving in the Pentagon, I asked him, this was many years ago, what are you going to say to your Australian comrades, when you get back? He said, I will tell them that the thing to understand about the United States government is that it is designed not to work. That's not a bug. That is, from the American point of view, the feature. And there's actually a lot of truth to that. It is designed not to work. Now, like any system, it can be perverted. There are things you can do, and they are trying to do some of them. So I'm not being flippant. I think this is a very dangerous administration, particularly with regard to civil liberties and so on. But they will find it hard to turn it into an effective dictatorship, partly because of their own incompetence, partly because of their own internal divisions, and partly, I think, because there are going to be various forces that are going to resist them in a variety of ways.
Well, Eliot, thank you very much for your time today.
Always good to be with you.
Thanks, Eliot. See you next time.
The troubles in Northern Ireland are raging. Civilians find themselves caught in the crosshairs.
My father was covered in blood.
Behind the violence, there's a sinister secret.
He is probably the most high-profile British agent that we know of to date.
A covert unit of the British Army is connected to a string of murders.
If you could recruit a terrorist, that's the cream on the cake.
And the fight for justice continues.
There wasn't just one agent. Most of them were agents.
The latest podcast from The Telegraph. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies. Search Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
Well, thanks very much, Joe, and thanks, Dom, for that. So let's turn, though, to our final thoughts. Joe, I think your mic's still on. That's not Kai Callis, is it? Anyway, let's go to final thoughts now. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners as you enter your exciting weekend?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Well, I'll leave them here with me if I may. So just a reminder, the theme of this conference here in Tallinn is We Shall Go Forward Together. Now, as I said, there's a lot of the Euro kind of foreign policy and defence policy royalty here, but noticeable by the absence, apart from the think tankers and journalists and what have you, there's not great representation from the governments of Britain, France, Germany. And so in this context now of the bluff being called, Putin did not roll from that 3-day goodwill gesture of a ceasefire into Zelensky's proposed 30-day ceasefire. And that supposedly is going to then trigger all these sanctions, which I know is being talked about. And that we've seen chat in the last few days. But not an awful lot has happened. There's been not an awful lot of statements since the 30-day ceasefire that didn't happen. So there's a lot of people here from the kind of further north and further east in Europe that you go. And they've always been very, very clear-eyed about this threat from Russia. So I'm expecting a lot of similar language now, but without Britain, France, Germany here, and without meaningful talk on actually what's going to happen about rolling out this next program of sanctions. This idea we shall go forward together. I've just got a few questions which I will be putting to these people on your behalf to say, well, how together are we? If, as I say, further north and further east you go, it's much harder, the language, than actually the bigger economies and defence forces in Europe from Britain, France and Germany. So how together is this European response now that the bluff has been called? That's what I'm going to be digging into in the next couple of days.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Good luck. And of course, we look forward to hearing how you got on Monday. Joe Barnes, where do you want to leave listeners?
Sorry for leaving my mic on. I was watching diplomats scurrying across the square and I was wondering where they were going and if I needed to chase along. But no, I will leave my final thought in Istanbul, where I was yesterday on Thursday, where we're seeing the first pictures from those talks happening. We've seen the picture of the Turkish delegation, which I think was the Turkish foreign minister and the Turkish national intelligence chief sitting at one end of the table, and opposite each other were the Ukrainians and the Russians. And I'm hearing from those talks that the Ukrainians... So let me take a step back. Yesterday, we were talking a lot about how the Russians sent a delegation, which was basically a mirror image of the delegation they used to try and force Ukraine's capitulation in the early days of the full-scale invasion, in those first initial and the last direct peace talks. Today, the Ukrainians have spoken through an interpreter and translator to their Russian counterparts, which I think is a huge sign of resolve in the face of what is a distinct Russian message that we are still trying to force Ukraine's capitulation. I'm sure, I don't know for a fact, that the Ukrainians who are there on that delegation, led by the defense minister, Rustem Umerov, most likely speak Russian. They could have spoken Russian directly to their counterparts, but instead they opted to speak Ukrainian, which is essentially a country that the Russians insist no longer exists. So a real sign of resolve, and I think it's interesting and fascinating and quite frankly, good to see that Ukrainians won't be cowed by this Russian attempt to, again, force their capitulation.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.